The dust of the main street plumed around the hem of her worn wool skirt with every deliberate step. The midday sun beat down upon the wooden awnings of Oak Haven, casting long, sharp shadows that offered no true relief from the stifling heat. Mei Lin carried the heavy leather satchel tightly against her side, the strap biting into her shoulder, a physical reminder of the burden she bore. She was a woman entirely alone in a landscape that did not forgive isolation. Her husband, Thomas, had succumbed to a sudden violent fever 3 weeks prior on the trail, leaving her with nothing but his debts, his meticulously kept but currently useless ledger books, and a profound, echoing silence in her chest. She possessed a quiet dignity, her spine straight despite the exhaustion that threatened to pull her down into the alkali dirt. She had walked from the stagecoach depot to the mercantile, the townspeople watching her with eyes that were hard and unyielding, their faces closed off like shuttered windows against an approaching storm. The mercantile was a large, imposing structure of fresh-cut pine that dominated the center of town, its wide windows displaying goods that May could no longer afford to even look upon. Above the door, a painted sign announced the establishment belonged to Silas Vance, a man who also owned the local bank and a significant portion of the valley's fertile bottomland. May pushed open the heavy wooden door, the brass bell above it chiming with a cheerful sound that felt entirely at odds with the hollow ache in her stomach. The air inside was cool, smelling of roasted coffee beans, oiled leather, and the sharp tang of pickling vinegar. She approached the long wooden counter where Mr. Vance stood. He was a man of middling height and expanding girth, his waistcoat tailored from fine eastern wool, his smile practiced and utterly devoid of warmth. He watched her approach with the calculating gaze of a man who evaluated everything in terms of profit and loss, his eyes lingering on the dust coating her boots and the frayed edges of her morning dress. May placed her hands flat on the polished wood of the counter, keeping her voice level and formal. She explained her situation without pleading, outlining her skills with numbers, her ability to manage accounts, and her willingness to perform whatever labor was required to earn her keep. She did not ask for charity, only for the opportunity to prove her worth. Silas Vance listened, his smile never wavering, his fingers drumming a slow, rhythmic pattern against the counter. When she finished, the silence in the store stretched out, heavy and suffocating. Several other patrons, locals who owed their livelihoods to Vance's credit, paused in their browsing to listen, their presence a silent wall of judgment. Vance leaned forward, his voice a low, smooth purr that carried clearly across the quiet room. He told her that Oak Haven was a respectable town, a place that valued established roots and known quantities. He suggested, with a veneer of polite concern that barely masked his contempt, that a woman in her unfortunate and unattached position would be better suited returning to wherever she had come from, or perhaps seeking employment in the less savoury establishments found in the mining camps further west. The implication hung in the air, toxic and undeniable. When May stood her ground, her dark eyes flashing with a sudden, suppressed anger, Vance's smile vanished. He loudly accused her of loitering, his voice rising to ensure the entire store could hear. He pointed a thick finger toward the door, declaring that he would not have vagrants disturbing his paying customers, and threatened to call the town constable if she did not remove herself from his property immediately. The public humiliation washed over May like a wave of freezing water, but she did not let her shoulders slump. She picked up her heavy satchel, her knuckles white, and turned away from the counter. The faces of the townspeople were a blur of apathy and veiled hostility as she walked back out into the blinding sunlight. She stood on the edge of the boardwalk, the vast empty expanse of the frontier stretching out before her, a terrifying ocean of sagebrush and jagged peaks. The reality of her situation settled upon her with a crushing weight. She was destitute, entirely without allies, and trapped in a town that had just collectively decided she was unworthy of basic human decency. Grief, she realized in that moment, moved like weather. It was not a steady state, but a series of sudden squalls and oppressive calms, and right now she was standing in the dead center of a howling storm with no shelter in sight. From the deep shadows of the livery stable awning across the street, Elias Thorne watched the scene unfold. Elias was a man carved from the very landscape he inhabited, tall and weathered, with eyes the colour of bruised slate. He was the owner of the Broken Spur, a sprawling ranch that occupied the high country north of town. He was a man of few words, known for his solitary nature and his unyielding sense of honour. He had buried his own wife 5 years ago, and since that day he had built high fences around his heart, retreating into the grueling, endless work of his land. He came to town only for supplies and necessary business, tolerating the noise and the crowds with a stoic patience. He had been tightening the cinch on his saddle when the raised voice of Silas Vance had drifted across the dusty thoroughfare. Elias knew Vance well. He knew the man's superficially polite demeanour hid a predatory nature, a greed that consumed everything it touched. He had seen Vance foreclose on struggling homesteaders with a sympathetic smile, taking their land for pennies on the dollar. Watching Vance turn his cruelty upon a solitary, grieving woman struck a chord deep within Elias's chest, vibrating against a sense of justice he rarely allowed himself to act upon in the affairs of others. He observed the way the widow carried herself, the quiet resilience in her posture as she absorbed the insult and walked away. There was no panic in her movements, only a profound, exhausted calculation. She was a woman who had been stripped of everything, yet refused to break. Elias stepped out from the shade of the livery, the sunlight catching the silver conchos on his leather chaps. The rhythmic creak of his boots against the boardwalk sounded loud in the tense quiet that had settled over the street following Vance's outburst. He crossed the distance with long, deliberate strides, his gaze fixed entirely upon the woman standing at the edge of the road. The townspeople watched him, their murmurs dying away. Elias Thorne was a respected figure, a man whose wealth and independence placed him beyond the reach of Silas Vance's petty tyranny. He stopped a few feet from May, removing his sweat-stained Stetson and holding it against his leg. He looked down at her, taking in the fine, intelligent lines of her face, the dark smudges of exhaustion beneath her eyes, and the fierce, guarded pride that radiated from her. May looked up at the towering figure before her. She saw a man whose face was lined by sun and sorrow, his expression unreadable, but devoid of the mockery she had just endured. She braced herself for another rejection, another demand that she move along. Her voice, when she spoke, was tight with the effort of maintaining her composure. She told him what she had told the merchant, that she was willing to work, that she was capable, but the words felt hollow now, defeated by the town's collective verdict. She looked away, staring at the dusty toes of her boots. "Nobody will hire me," the widow said, her voice dropping to a whisper that held the absolute finality of her despair. Elias stood in silence for a long moment. He looked past her, toward the mercantile where Vance was watching them through the glass, his face pressed into a scowl of suspicion. Elias looked back down at the woman. He did not feel pity. Pity was a useless emotion, a fragile thing that broke under the weight of real hardship. What he felt was a sudden, crystal-clear recognition of a kindred spirit, a soul that had been battered by the world but refused to surrender its dignity. He saw the heavy satchel she carried, the practical, capable look of her hands. His own massive house at the Broken Spur was a silent tomb, dusty and neglected, a place he only used for sleeping. His account books were a tangled mess he had ignored for months. He needed help, and she needed a sanctuary. "I am not hiring," the rancher smiled, the expression so rare it felt like a physical effort, softening the harsh lines of his face and bringing a sudden, surprising warmth to his slate-coloured eyes. "I am asking." He spoke the words plainly, without flourish or hidden condition. He explained that his ranch was a day's ride into the foothills, that the work would be hard and the isolation profound. He offered her a place to stay, a fair wage for managing his ledgers and bringing some order to his chaotic household and the protection of his name. He framed it entirely as a mutually beneficial transaction, carefully preserving the dignity she had fought so hard to maintain. He reached out, not to touch her, but to gently take the heavy satchel from her hands. May looked at him, searching his face for the catch, the hidden cost that always seemed to accompany salvation. She found only a steady, calm certainty. He was offering her a lifeline, not out of charity, but out of a practical recognition of her worth. She released her grip on the satchel, the sudden absence of its weight making her feel momentarily unmoored. She took a deep, shuddering breath, the first full breath she had managed since her husband's passing. She nodded once, a sharp, decisive motion. She would accept his offer, and she would prove to this man and to this unforgiving town that she was entirely capable of forging her own survival. The journey to the Broken Spur took the remainder of the day. They rode in Elias's buckboard, the wooden wheels grinding a steady rhythm against the rocky trail that wound upward into the high country. The landscape changed as they climbed, the dusty sagebrush giving way to towering stands of ponderosa pine and sweeping meadows of golden grass. The air grew cooler, carrying the sharp, clean scent of pine needles and distant snowmelt. They rode in an easy, companionable silence, the vastness of the territory making conversation feel unnecessary. Elias drove the team with a practiced, effortless skill, his attention focused on the trail ahead, giving May the space to process the sudden, violent shift in her circumstances. They arrived at the ranch just as the sun began to dip below the jagged peaks of the western ridge, casting long purple shadows across the valley floor. The main house was a sprawling, sturdy structure built of heavy logs and river stone, sitting upon a rise that commanded a view of the entire basin. It was a beautiful place, but as Elias led her inside, May saw the profound neglect that had taken root. Dust lay thick on the heavy oak furniture, the hearth was cold and filled with old ashes, and the air held the stale, heavy scent of a place that had not been truly lived in for years. Elias showed her to a large, comfortable room at the back of the house, pointed out the kitchen and the pantry, and then retreated to the barn, leaving her alone to survey her new domain. May did not waste time mourning the state of the house. She found a strange, fierce comfort in the physical labor. Over the next week, she threw herself into the work with a methodical, relentless energy. She scrubbed the floors until the wood gleamed, beat the dust from the rugs, and washed the windows until the golden mountain light poured freely into the rooms. She found a neglected patch of earth near the kitchen door and began to turn the soil, planting seeds she had carried in her satchel, coaxing life from the hard ground. She took inventory of the pantry, organized the supplies, and began to cook meals that filled the hollow house with the rich, comforting aromas of roasting meat and baking bread. Elias watched this transformation with a quiet, growing astonishment. He had expected her to clean, to manage the basic necessities, but he had not anticipated the fierce competence she brought to every task. She moved through his house, not as a servant, but as a woman claiming her rightful space. The crushing silence that had dominated his life for 5 years was replaced by the steady, rhythmic sounds of her work. He found himself lingering near the house during the day, listening to the soft hum of her voice as she worked in the garden, watching the precise, economical way she moved. He realized, with a sudden, unsettling jolt, that he looked forward to returning to the house at the end of the day, a feeling he had thought entirely dead within him. It was in the evenings, after the supper dishes were cleared, that she turned her attention to his ledgers. Elias had surrendered the heavy, leather-bound books with a grimace of apology, admitting he had let them slide. May sat at the heavy oak dining table, a single oil lamp casting a pool of warm yellow light over the pages, and began to untangle the financial history of the Broken Spur. She worked late into the night, her brow furrowed in concentration, her pen scratching a steady rhythm against the paper. She possessed a brilliant, analytical mind, and numbers spoke to her with a clarity that human interactions often lacked. As she cross-referenced the cattle sales with the bank deposits and the mercantile receipts, a disturbing pattern began to emerge from the ink. The discrepancies were subtle at first, small amounts skimmed from the top of large transactions, a rounding error here, an inflated fee there, But as she dug deeper, tracing the lines of credit and the interest rates applied by Silas Vance's bank, the picture became glaringly clear. Vance had been systematically bleeding the broken spur for years. He had used complex, convoluted accounting tricks to inflate the cost of supplies and suppress the recorded profits from the cattle drives, slowly tightening a financial noose around Elias's neck without the rancher ever realizing the danger. It was a methodical, cowardly theft, executed with the stroke of a pen rather than the barrel of a gun. May presented her findings to Elias on a quiet Tuesday evening. They sat on the wide front porch, the darkness of the valley spread out beneath them, the only sound the distant, mournful cry of a coyote. She laid the ledgers open on the small table between them, pointing out the fraudulent entries with a steady, uncompromising finger. She explained the mechanics of the theft clearly and concisely, her voice devoid of emotion, presenting the facts as indisputable truths. Elias listened in silence, his jaw tight, his eyes fixed on the numbers. He did not doubt her. He had seen the sharp intelligence in her eyes, the meticulous care she took with everything she touched. The realization that he had been played for a fool by a man he despised burned entirely through his usual stoicism, leaving a cold, hard anger in its wake. The dynamic between them shifted that night. The formal, polite distance they had maintained dissolved, replaced by a deep, unspoken partnership forged in the face of a shared enemy. Elias began to consult her on matters beyond the household, discussing the movement of the herds, the purchase of winter feed, the strategic management of the land. He listened to her opinions, valuing her sharp insight and her practical, unclouded judgment. They spent their evenings on the porch, the silence between them no longer awkward or heavy, but comfortable and deeply understood. They were two solitary people who had built high walls against the world, slowly realizing that they had left a gate open for each other. Word of the widow residing at the broken spur eventually trickled down into the valley, carried by the ranch hands who rode into town for their Saturday night whiskey. In the gossiping echo chamber of Oakhaven, the arrangement was quickly twisted into something scandalous. The town, led by the quiet, venomous whispers of Silas Vance, decided that the situation was highly improper. Vance, whose own spies had informed him that the widow was spending her nights poring over Elias's ledgers, recognized the profound threat she posed. If she uncovered his years of systematic theft, his reputation, his bank, and his entire empire of influence would shatter. He needed her gone, and he needed Elias isolated and ignorant once more. Vance chose a day when he knew Elias was moving a herd of yearlings to the upper pasture, leaving the main house relatively unprotected. He rode out to the broken spur, accompanied by 3 of his most imposing hired men, individuals who functioned more as thugs than ranch hands. They arrived in a cloud of dust, their horses tearing up the carefully tended soil near the entrance. Vance dismounted, his face set in an expression of deep paternal concern, a mask that slipped slightly when he saw May standing on the porch, a heavy iron skillet held casually but firmly in her right hand. She did not shrink back. She stood at the top of the steps, her posture rigid, her dark eyes locking onto his with a fierce, unyielding intensity. Vance removed his hat, attempting a smile that failed to reach his cold eyes. He spoke in his smooth, practiced voice, claiming he had come out of concern for Elias's reputation, suggesting that her continued presence was causing a scandal that would damage the rancher's standing in the community. He offered her a small pouch of coins, framing it as a generous relocation fund, and advised her to pack her things before Elias returned. He thinly veiled his threat, mentioning a promissory note the bank held on a vital section of Elias's winter grazing land, implying he would call the note due immediately if the moral character of the broken spur was not rectified. May listened to his speech without interruption, the iron skillet heavy and reassuring in her grip. When he finished, she did not look at the pouch of coins. She looked directly at Vance, her voice ringing out clear and sharp across the dusty yard. She quoted specific dates and amounts from the ledgers, detailing the exact sums he had stolen from Elias over the past 3 years. She explained, with chilling precision, the legal ramifications of banking fraud. She told him that she would not be leaving, that his threats were as hollow as his morality, and that if he or his men took one step onto the porch, she would introduce his skull to the cast iron in her hand. Vance's face mottled with rage and sudden, stark fear. He had expected a cowering, desperate woman. He had found a fortress. He spat a curse, turned on his heel, and signaled his men to ride out, leaving a thick cloud of dust and a promise of retribution in their wake. The retribution came 3 nights later, carried on the back of a howling autumn wind. The dry season had stretched long, turning the prairie grass into brittle tinder. May awoke in the dead of night to the smell of wood smoke, thick and acrid, burning the back of her throat. She threw off her blankets, rushing to the window. The sky to the east, near the main barns where the winter hay and the prized breeding stock were kept, was glowing with a sickly, terrifying orange light. The wind was whipping the flames into a frenzy, driving the fire directly toward the wooden structures. She did not scream. She pulled on her boots, grabbed a heavy wool blanket, and ran out into the chaotic, roaring night. The yard was a scene of absolute pandemonium. The ranch hands were shouting, hauling buckets of water from the trough, their faces illuminated by the hellish glare of the fire. Elias was in the center of the chaos, his shirt torn, soot streaking his face as he desperately tried to coordinate the defense. The fire had been deliberately set in the dry brush piled against the windward side of the main barn, a cowardly, destructive act designed to cripple the ranch. The flames were licking at the dry wooden siding, the intense heat pushing the men back. Inside the barn, the panicked screams of the trapped horses cut through the roar of the fire, a sound that tore at May's heart. Elias grabbed a soaked blanket and charged toward the barn doors, intent on freeing the animals. But a burning beam from the loft above crashed down, blocking the main entrance and sending a shower of sparks over him. He staggered back, clutching his left arm, his face contorted in agony as the heat seared his flesh. The ranch hands hesitated, the wall of flame appearing insurmountable. May saw Elias fall back, saw the despair flash in his eyes as he realized he could not reach the horses. She did not think. She acted on pure, adrenaline-fueled instinct. She ran to the water trough, plunged her heavy wool blanket into the freezing water until it was completely saturated, and threw it over her head and shoulders. She bypassed the blocked main doors, running toward a smaller side entrance that the fire had not yet fully consumed. She kicked the door open, disappearing into the thick, choking smoke. The heat inside was a physical weight, pressing down on her lungs, singeing the edges of her hair. She kept low, moving by memory and touch toward the stalls. She found the release latches, her fingers burning against the hot metal, and threw the stall doors open. She shouted, waving her arms, driving the terrified, rearing animals toward the open side door. She slapped their flanks, forcing them out into the cool night air, refusing to leave until the last stall was empty. As she turned to escape, a section of the roof collapsed behind her, sending a wall of heat and ash rushing forward. She threw herself through the doorway, tumbling into the dust of the yard just as the interior of the barn became an absolute inferno. Strong hands grabbed her, hauling her away from the intense heat. She looked up, gasping for air, her lungs burning, to see Elias kneeling beside her. His face was pale beneath the soot, his eyes wide with a terror she had never seen in him before. He was clutching his left arm tightly against his chest, the fabric of his sleeve charred and smoking, but his entire focus was on her. He checked her for injuries, his large, calloused hands remarkably gentle as he brushed the smouldering embers from her ruined dress. The ranch hands had managed to contain the fire to the barn, preventing it from spreading to the house or the main pastures, but the structure itself was a total loss. The danger had passed, leaving behind a heavy, exhausted silence broken only by the crackle of dying flames and the nervous snorting of the rescued horses. They retreated to the kitchen of the main house. The room was dark, illuminated only by the faint light of a single lantern. May sat at the heavy oak table, her hands trembling slightly as the adrenaline finally began to recede. Elias stood by the sink, his jaw clenched in pain as she carefully cut away the charred fabric of his sleeve and began to clean the severe burn on his forearm. She worked with methodical precision, applying a soothing salve and wrapping the wound in clean white linen. The silence between them was profound, heavy with the weight of what had just occurred, the sheer, terrifying proximity of loss. "You could have died in there," Elias said, his voice a low, rough gravel that barely broke the silence. He was not looking at his arm, he was looking directly at her, his slate-coloured eyes entirely stripped of their usual guarded distance. May did not look up from her task. She tied the final knot on the bandage, her fingers lingering for a fraction of a second against the warm, solid muscle of his forearm. It was the first time they had shared genuine, caring physical contact, and the sensation sent a jolt of awareness straight through her chest. "The horses are your livelihood, Elias," she replied, her voice remarkably steady. "I could not stand by and watch you lose everything, not when I had the power to stop it." Elias reached out with his uninjured hand and gently tilted her chin up until she was forced to meet his gaze. "I was not afraid of losing the horses, May," he said, the earnest melancholy in his tone cracking open to reveal a deep, raw vulnerability. "When I saw you run into that smoke, I felt the world end. I spent 5 years building fences to keep the grief out. I thought I had succeeded, but watching you, I realized I haven't been keeping the grief out. I've just been locking myself in." He paused, his thumb brushing lightly against a smudge of soot on her cheek. "I won't lose someone I care for again. I refuse." May looked into his eyes and saw the echo of her own profound loneliness, the shared understanding of what it meant to survive the absolute worst the world could offer. She leaned slightly into the warmth of his hand, a small involuntary surrender. "My husband was a good man," she whispered, the confession tumbling out into the quiet room. "But when he died, I realized I was nothing without him. No property, no standing, just a burden to be discarded. I promised myself I would never be that vulnerable again. I would be useful, I would be strong, but I would never rely on anyone to define my place in the world." She took a breath, the smell of smoke still clinging to her clothes. "But you never asked me to be a burden. You only ever asked me to be a partner." They sat in the quiet kitchen until the first grey light of dawn began to creep through the windows, the silence between them no longer a wall but a bridge. The crucible of the fire had burned away the last remnants of their caution, leaving only a stark, undeniable truth. They had faced the fire together, and they had survived. The morning light brought a cold, hard clarity. Elias and May rode into Oakhaven, the buckboard loaded not with supplies, but with the heavy, leather-bound ledgers. Elias drove the team with a grim, unyielding purpose, his bandaged arm resting carefully on his knee. May sat beside him, her spine straight, her face a mask of absolute calm. They did not speak. The plan had been forged in the silent hours before dawn. They were not going to seek justice in the shadows. They were going to drag it out into the unforgiving light of the public square. They stopped the buckboard directly in front of the bank, the heart of Silas Vance's power. The town was already awake, the morning routines halting as the townspeople recognized the rigid fury radiating from the rancher and the cold determination of the widow beside him. Elias stepped down, turning to assist May. He did not offer his hand out of mere politeness. He offered it as a statement of unified strength. Together they walked up the wooden steps to the heavy double doors of the bank. Elias did not bother to knock. He kicked the doors open with his heavy boot, the sound echoing like a gunshot down the quiet street. Silas Vance was seated behind his large mahogany desk, counting the morning deposits. He looked up, his face immediately draining of colour as he saw Elias standing in the doorway, the soot still ground into his clothes, his arm wrapped in white linen. Vance tried to stand, tried to summon his usual bluster, but the words died in his throat as May stepped forward, slamming the heavy ledgers onto the polished surface of his desk. "Sheriff Miller!" Elias's voice roared out of the open doorway, carrying across the street to the jailhouse. The townspeople, drawn by the commotion, began to gather on the boardwalk, peering nervously through the large glass windows. Sheriff Miller, a fair-minded man who had long suspected Vance's dealings but lacked the proof to act, pushed his way through the crowd, his hand resting cautiously on the butt of his revolver. As the sheriff entered, May opened the ledgers. With the cold, precise logic of a mathematician, she laid out the evidence. She pointed to the inflated interest charges, the phantom supply costs, the systematic skimming of the cattle profits. She cross-referenced the dates in the ledger with the bank's own public records, exposing the glaring, undeniable fraud. She did not raise her voice, but every word she spoke was a hammer blow against Vance's carefully constructed empire. Vance stammered, attempting to claim the numbers were a mistake, a misunderstanding, but the evidence was overwhelming. He looked at the faces of the townspeople pressed against the glass, the men and women he held under his financial thumb, and he saw not fear but a sudden, dangerous realization of their own exploitation. Sheriff Miller reviewed the pages, his face darkening with anger. He looked at Vance, who was now trembling, his cowardly nature fully exposed beneath the veneer of respectability. The sheriff pulled his handcuffs from his belt, the metallic clink sounding incredibly loud in the dead silent room. "Silas Vance," the lawman stated, his voice devoid of any sympathy. "I am placing you under arrest for fraud, grand larceny, and the suspected orchestration of arson at the Broken Spur Ranch. You have bled this town dry for the last time." The public unmasking was absolute. As Vance was led out of his own bank in irons, the townspeople parted to let him pass, their silence a heavier condemnation than any shouted insults. His power, built on intimidation and deceit, had been shattered by the undeniable truth contained within a set of meticulously kept books. Elias and May walked out of the bank together, the morning sun feeling suddenly warmer, the air cleaner. They climbed back into the buckboard, turning their backs on the town, their faces turned toward the mountains, toward home. The ride back to the Broken Spur was slow, the tension of the confrontation bleeding away, replaced by a profound, exhausted peace. When they finally reached the ranch, they stopped near the blackened remains of the main barn. The destruction was severe, but as Elias looked at it, he did not feel despair. He felt the solid, reassuring presence of the woman sitting beside him. He tied off the reins and turned to face her on the wooden seat of the wagon. He did not offer a flowery declaration of love. He was a man of the earth, and his words were grounded in the practical reality of their lives. "The arrangement we made," Elias began, his voice steady, his slate eyes holding hers with an unwavering intensity. "It served its purpose. You saved my ranch, May. You saved my life. But I find that I am no longer satisfied with an arrangement." He took off his hat, his hands resting on his knees. "I need a partner, not just for the ledgers, and not just to keep the house from falling into dust. I want you to stay. Not as a housekeeper, not as an employee. I am asking you to stay as my wife. We will build a new barn. We will build a life. Together." May looked at him, the earnest melancholy of his proposal resonating perfectly with the practical, guarded truth of her own heart. He was not offering her a fairy tale. He was offering her a solid, unshakable reality. He was offering her a place where her competence was valued, where her strength was recognized, and where her heart was safe. She reached across the space between them, her small, capable hand covering his large, calloused one. "I accept your proposal, Elias," she said, her voice bright and clear, a quiet smile finally breaking across her face. "But I will still manage the ledgers. I trust you with my life, but your math is terrible." Elias let out a sudden, rough bark of laughter, a sound that startled the horses and echoed off the surrounding mountains, bright and full of life. It was a sound of absolute, earned joy. A year passed, the seasons turning with their relentless, beautiful rhythm. The harsh winter gave way to a brilliant, wet spring, and then to a long, golden summer. The Broken Spur thrived under their combined stewardship. A new barn, larger and sturdier than the last, now stood on the ashes of the old, its fresh-cut pine siding gleaming in the sun. The garden May had planted was a riot of colour and life, providing a bounty that filled the pantry shelves. The ledgers were perfectly balanced, the herds were strong, and the financial shadow of Silas Vance was nothing more than a bitter memory. The town of Oak Haven had changed as well. With Vance gone, the suffocating grip of debt had loosened, and a new, cautious prosperity had begun to take root. When Elias and May rode into town now, they were met not with suspicion, but with a deep, grudging respect. They were pillars of the community, but they stood apart, their strength drawn entirely from each other. On a warm evening in late September, as the golden hour cast long, peaceful shadows across the valley, Elias and May sat together on the wide front porch. The air was cool, smelling of dried sage and the approaching autumn. Elias sat in a heavy wooden rocking chair, a sleeping hound resting at his feet. May sat beside him on the porch swing, the gentle creak of the chains providing a steady, comforting rhythm. She was mending a tear in one of his heavy canvas work shirts, her needle flashing silver in the fading light. Elias watched her work, a profound sense of contentment settling deep within his chest. He thought about the day she had arrived, destitute and alone, facing down the cruelty of the town with nothing but her unyielding dignity. He thought about the high, lonely fences he had built, and how she had systematically, quietly dismantled them, not with force, but with a steady, undeniable grace. He reached out, his hand finding hers, stopping the movement of the needle. He didn't say a word. The silence between them was rich and full, requiring no explanation. May looked up, her dark eyes reflecting the golden light of the setting sun, and smiled. They sat together as the stars began to pinprick the darkening sky. Two solitary souls who had navigated the storm and finally found their way to a lasting, deeply earned peace, secure in the quiet strength of the world they had built together.